meeting or the open house.
Okay, good. This
Format.
Yeah, because it's a little more informal.
Yeah, watched on YouTube and
We're live, Aaron.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, we are live.
Thank you, Aaron. I'd like to call this Committee of the Whole workshop meeting on October 28th, 2020 to order at 4 p.m. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Councillor Adam Russell, Chair of today's Committee of the Whole workshop. We are meeting electronically through Zoom during this declared emergency period. Members of the public may observe the proceedings by accessing the live webcast on our YouTube channel. I'm going to do a roll call. I will ask our clerk to complete the roll call of committee so that we can confirm everyone's attendance as we are holding this meeting electronically today, and we need to confirm quorum. Aaron, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I shall now conduct the roll call. When members hear your name, please say here. Chair Russell?
Here.
Councillor Ujima?
Here.
Councillor Brunet?
Here.
Councillor Pachariva?
Here.
Councillor McPherson? Sorry, Councillor McPherson?
Here.
Thank you. Councillor Miklick?
Here.
Councillor Timmers?
Here.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Councillor Miklick. Did you say here? Sorry,
Here.
oh, thank you. Councillor Timmers?
Here.
Excellent, thank you. And Councillor Reimer will be joining us momentarily, and so will Her Worship the Mayor.
Okay, thank you, Aaron.
Mr. Chair, we have quorum.
Thank you, Aaron. In addition, I want to take a moment to welcome the staff we have joining us electronically. We have our town clerk, Julie Kirkolos. We have our treasurer, Terry Trawala. We have our director of planning development, Kathleen Dale. We have our director of community services, Shannon McKay. We have our economic development officer, Paul Deaney. See him? And we have our director of public works, Dave Graham. We also have, I haven't seen Jillian on yet. So, oh, there she is. We have our manager of environmental services, Jillian Harris. We also have our associate director of finance, Rosalie Potter, though she is camera shy. And I believe we have also a camera shy Kayla Snow, our finance clerk. And moderating and clerking the meeting today, we have our legislative and committee coordinator, Aaron Plant. As this meeting is a virtual meeting, I will ask that we follow some procedures during this electronic meeting. Should there be a connection or a service disruption for the chair, or if quorum is lost, the chair and or the clerk will call a 10-minute recess to reconnect and regain quorum. If quorum is lost, the meeting will be adjourned. If connection is lost from the chair, the vice chair, Councillor Pachariva, will resume the meeting. Once reconnection to the chair is achieved, the chair will assume his role. Each member of committee who wishes to speak, please press the raise hand feature on your video call, and the clerk will track our speakers list today and then invite you to speak when I open it up for comments or questions. Please save your comments for the end. Also, when I finish reading a motion and announcing the mover and the seconder, the clerk will then call out the vote by reading each member of committee's name out loud. Please remember to take yourselves off mute during this portion of the meeting so that you can confirm if you are in support or opposed. Also, when not speaking, please remember to keep yourselves on mute. Are there any declarations of interest? Seeing none, I'm just going to pull up my participants tab. Seeing none, there is no consent agenda, so we are going to move on to the regular agenda. So we are now considering items 7.1 presentation by Gary Scanlon and Byron Tan from Watson and Associates regarding water and wastewater rate study and water financial planning. The rate study will provide for a longer range projection of the town's capital operating budget, along with providing a life cycle asset management plan for the infrastructure replacement needs. As a product of this review, a 10-year forecast of water and wastewater rates will be provided for 2021 to 2030. This forecast and analysis will provide the details to allow for the preparation of the mandatory OREG 453/07 financial report, which must be submitted to the province to fulfill the licensing requirements. Watson's approach is to undertake the analysis in a collaborative manner with the town staff in order to provide a rate study and accompanying financial plan. The intent of this workshop is to present the preliminary recommendations for water and wastewater rates to financially support the 10-year forecast or capital projects in operations. Following this workshop, Watson will incorporate the feedback provided by council into the plan before bringing back the financial plan and rate study for council approval. Watson's extensive experience assisting nearly half of Ontario municipalities with water rate studies and financial plans over the last 38 years. With us today, we have Gary Scanlon. Gary supports about 150 municipalities across Canada in economic, local government, and planning matters. In 2001, Gary had considerable involvement with Walkerton. With the Walkerton inquiry, and has since been working with about 70 municipalities to establish water and wastewater rate structures that will ensure future financial sustainability. Gary often authors and presents on matters relating to the Development Charges Act, revenue, alternatives to taxation, privatization of municipal services, municipal financial planning, and full cost pricing of water and wastewater services. He frequently appears before the Ontario Municipal Board and other tribunals on behalf of municipalities. Byron Tan is also joining us. Byron works primarily in the areas of financial or municipal finance, development charges, water and wastewater rate studies, and fiscal impact assessments. With a background in business economics, he has a valuable experience in analytics, forecasting, and project management. Gentlemen, I will turn this over to you for your presentation. So if you will, please go ahead and take yourselves on mute and proceed.
Thank you, Councillor. Pleasure to be before you today. I think, well, we have a presentation. I'm just not quite sure. There we go. So we thought we would provide a presentation. If we go to the next slide, we'll just give you a bit of an overview where we're going to go in today's discussion. So I'd always, for the benefit of councillors, like to go back and just refresh your memories on the legislation that's in place. As you noted, Mr. Chair, considerable amount of legislation arising from Walkerton, and these are the fundamentals that guide you as a council and staff in providing the water and wastewater services. We'll then go from there into the mechanics or the calculations that we've undertaken and some of the issues that we're identifying through that process. There's a significant amount of capital. You're experiencing growth. With that, there's the benefit from having added customers in the future, but on the downside, there's a significant amount of infrastructure you have to provide to support them. So we'll go through all of these matters and then talk about the impacts ultimately on your water rates and your wastewater rates. Next slide, please. So really, I've covered this off, but we'll be talking about the different inputs into the system, which is a lot of the key drivers today in watching the change in water and wastewater rates is the needs for either new infrastructure or replacement infrastructure. And as a result of that, they'll be having to address the financial aspects of it. So we'll look at the operating budget as well, and then provide you, as I say, with the proposed rates. Next slide, please. So obviously, since Walkerton, that was a significant event. The municipality of Brockton or Walkerton in specifics, there was 5,200 people and 4,700 of them were sick, and 7 people died. And it was all as a result of a contaminated well, which affected the whole area. As a result of Walkerton, these are the significant changes that affect municipal water systems. The first two are the legislation which were introduced in the middle of the Walkerton hearing. So the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is in effect today, it's the major piece of legislation which guides most aspects of municipal water, providing municipal water to the residents. It monitors the quality of the water, so how much disinfection needs to be provided, provides you with the requirements of being licensed to run the system, establishes minimum criteria for staff training, establishes laboratory protocols, etc. So that's the major piece of legislation which guides your day-to-day activities. They also introduced the next one, which is Sustainable Water and Sewage Systems Act. That's a mouthful, so historically it was called SWISA. So SWISA basically provided the requirement to develop long-term asset management plans, and then from the asset management plan, come up with a financial plan to provide the operating as well as address all of your capital needs into the future. So when you hear words like financial sustainability and such, this was the first key piece of legislation which was driving municipalities towards asset management and sustainability for the Water and the Systems Act. Now, it got passed, but they never put the regulations into play. And in fact, it was ultimately replaced by the Water Opportunities Act. And I'll come down to that in a minute, because I'm going to give you a little bit more detail, because that's the pending legislation that you'll see what will have an impact over the next 3 to 5 years on your rates. When the first two pieces of legislation were put in under the Harris government, and then there was a change, the McGuinty government came into play, and the Liberal government decided to take a step back and just review all of this information, and developed a policy paper that was called Watertight, which took another 2 or 3 years to evolve and then go through a public process. And ultimately, the recommendations weren't put into place, which left a bit of a void, because under the Safe Drinking Water Act, there's a mandatory requirement for you to be licensed to run your systems. And with that license, you're going to provide your drinking water permit, apply for accreditation, or demonstrate that you're an accredited authority for providing that. You have drinking water protocols, et cetera. So there's 5 different pieces of documentation that goes to the province in order for you to be approved for the license. One of those pieces of legislation, or one of those documents, I should say, is a financial plan. And what I'll present to you today really is what the elements of a true financial plan are, and to some extent what SWISA was trying to advance. But because they didn't have the legislation in place, they came in with an interim piece of legislation, which is this OREG 45307. Interim, but we're 13 years later and we're still having to provide financial plans under this regulation. In essence, what, for the most part, Regulation 45307 does is basically take the information I'll present to you today and requires municipalities to basically collapse it down into a financial statement format. So it's not as robust, it's not as guiding as the original SWISA was, but it was an interim, as I say, legislation to help satisfy the requirements for the Safe Drinking Water Act. So that's where we have the Water Opportunities Act coming into play over the next couple of years, and it will basically remove that 45307 regulation. There's the Clean Water Act. I won't get into much discussion on that, but you should be aware that it is basically watershed management. And in Southern Ontario, for the most part, the conservation authorities deal with that. And there are potential implications, but they'd be more at the regional level than at the local level. Then we have the Water Opportunities Act, which I'll go through in a little bit more detail in a minute. But in very simple terms, it's taking SWISA and it's expanding it into a little bit more detail. Then the one thing I wanted to point out in the further requirements is you're probably aware from your finance department that they've been moving forward on asset management, and asset management has been deemed a requirement through this Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act. So that's the piece of legislation which is moving municipalities, all municipalities across Ontario, to deal with inventorying all of their assets, undertaking some level of performance consideration, and then looking to develop financial sustainability plans of which water and wastewater are very essential services. So they fit into this Water Opportunities Act and financial plan we'll talk about. Next slide. So once again, Water Opportunities Act, it is really is broken into three different components. The first two aren't as essential for you, but the first one is the province wanted to foster water, wastewater, and stormwater technologies and ensure that they provide an economic base to foster those those industries. The second part is they want to establish water conservation plans to attain some targets for water conservation into the future. We don't have regulations right now, so we're not quite sure what those targets are meant for you in particular. The last one talks about preparing sustainability plans for water, wastewater, and you do see that stormwater has been added to this as the list of services. So into the future, we'll be doing not only water and wastewater, but there'll have to be sustainability plans for your stormwater service. Next slide just talks about that it was put into place in 2010. There have been limited regulations with it, so we're still waiting really for the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act to feed the information on your asset management plan so that we can develop these final financial plans. Next slide. What the Water Opportunities Act provides is 5 different things to include in this financial plan. You see the first one, the asset management plan for the physical infrastructure. And then from that, the financial plan, which is really how are we going to finance it? What are the implications on rates over time, et cetera. So those first 2 items are what was originally in SWISA. The third item talks about the conservation plan. So how do we work that into our calculations? And then the fourth item, an assessment of risk that may interfere with the future delivery of the service. And you must consider climate change as part of the risks that you're considering. And then the last one is just really a statement or an ideal to be considered, maintaining and improving the service to ensure that the future demand can be met, and as well consider technologies to improve the service or increase cooperation with other municipal service providers. So a broader statement that basically says, look at alternative ways so that you maximize the efficiency and potentially minimize the cost of achieving the service. So that's where we're targeting over the next few years. And if we go to the next slide. When I talked about the first bullet, the asset management plan, the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act is being staged over time. And the first part was by 2019 to have your policies, your broader overarching policies to be developed, and they'll guide how you carry out your evaluations. You can see that by 2021, you should have addressed your core municipal services, which are roads, water, wastewater, storm, and then the rest of the services by 2023. And then by 2024, pull them all together and basically evolve a long-term financial strategy to address all of that. Now, in my discussions with the province over the last little while, they're looking at implementing the Water Opportunity Act requirements as the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity plans are completed for water and wastewater. It is not clear at this time whether they'd start that process in 2021 or they'd require it by the end of the process in 2024. So, but we do know that they'll be staging the implementation of the Act in conjunction with this piece of legislation. And this just basically summarizes the timelines that I had identified in the schematic. So we can move forward. So that's what's coming down the pike at us. And so I thought it was important for you to understand some of the pressures that are on the water and wastewater system and some of the considerations that you'll need to keep in the forefront of your mind as you move through with your municipal budgets into the future. So we'll get into the mechanics of what we're providing in the rates. The starting point is your current rates that are in effect for this year. You, like 85% of the municipalities that have meters, you have a two-part system. One is you charge all of the users a monthly base charge. So it's a fixed amount that they pay, whether they're consuming water or they're down in Florida. Well, maybe not this year with COVID, but if you're down in Florida, you're a snowbird, you're not around, you still have to make contributions towards the water system and the wastewater system, because when you come back, you would expect that those systems are functioning adequately in order for you to continue with the service. So even though you're not there, the municipalities have to continue to maintain those systems for your behalf. Now, with your base charge, it increases depending on the size of the meter. So the bigger the meter, the larger the billing rate. And many municipalities, probably about 20% of those that have, 20 to 25% of those that have these base charges have this stepped up charge depending on the size of the of your meter. You have it there for water, you have it there for wastewater. You can see that it's $17, roughly $17.50 for your residential users, just under $17 on the wastewater side for your residential users. That half inch or up to 3/4 inch is basically your residential users. In addition to that, you contribute, you basically pay on the amount of water that flows through that your water meter. So you pay $2, roughly $2.10 per cubic meter for every for the flow that comes through towards the water system. And we use the water meter as a surrogate for your wastewater. And because to have a separate wastewater meter would be extremely expensive, because then you have a 2-meter system and such. You have to go through billings, collections, etc. So you have a two-part rate. You have, during the colder months, a charge of just under $2.50 per cubic meter that runs through your water meter. So you pay a higher charge in the colder months. And then during the summer, you June, July, August, you have a reduced rate, which is it's a seasonal rate to reflect that you may be using more water to water your lawn, wash your car, fill up the pool, etc. So historically, the town has sought to have this reduced rate for 3 months to give a level of relief and in recognition that not all the water is going back down the sewer. So those are the charges. So these are quarterly charges. I think I may have said monthly base. I apologize. Those are quarterly charges, and those are what's in effect today. There are special charges for the water haulers. You can see we charge some $85. And if you're a water service only, you have a slightly higher base charge for if you're not receiving both services. In the next slide. So when we're doing these calculations, obviously we're going to do two different things. We're going to determine what your costs are, so how much money we have to recover from your water bills, but then we have to estimate what the denominator is, so how much flow is coming through and how many customers, in order to actually do the calculations. So the first part here is demonstrating that denominator. So we've looked at the growth within the town over the next 10 years. You can see you've got about 6,800 water users currently. So those are the number of customers that are on the system. And we would forecast over time, obviously, an increase as growth occurs. So you've got more single family homes or apartments or medium density. So you can see that we have approximately just under 6,900 users as of 2020. And with the growth forecast, we'll have over 7,600 users by the end of the 10 years. Now, we use that base charge information to help us calculate the revenues that'll come from base charges in the future. So that's a key component of our calculations. And then from those users, we've also used that to assess how much additional flow will be going, those additional customers will be using more money, so there'll be more flow through the meters. So you can see that that second table has estimated the increase in the billable volumes. So we go from just below 1.8 million cubic meters in 2020 to just over 1.9 million cubic meters by the end of the forecast period. And you can see as well, we've got water hauler flows in there as well, because from this full information, we also have to calculate, because you purchase water from the region, we use this information to inform us on what our increased expenses to the region will be to purchase the water. So we've also included in here those flows in order to undertake that calculation. Next slide. On the wastewater side, you see slightly lower number of customers. Not all water customers provide or receive the wastewater service. So we've had to recalculate the number of customers as well as the flows. So you saw where the water flows for water were just under 1.8 million. For those wastewater users, the flows that come through those meters are about 1,350,000. So you can see there's a difference there. So we need to recalculate that because obviously the rates would be different for the wastewater users. Next slide. So now we've talked about, you know, the denominator and what's the growth that'll affect your operating expenses and capital over time. So this first part is looking at your capital needs over the next 10 years. So we've looked at the, in conjunction with staff and such, we've tried to estimate a 10-year capital budget, the estimates of the projects that we would need to provide, and the timing of that. The next slide gives you the forecast basically is about $32 million for the water program and about 18, almost 19 million for wastewater. Next slide. So these are detailed in the report that we'll provide. We've got the details, and we've also summarized what's infrastructure replacement versus what is growth-related costs. The financing option, what options we have to address the capital. There's not a lot of magic. If we receive external money, that either comes from development charges, so the developers are contributing as they grow. So that money comes into the reserves, but we can only use it for the growth-related projects. Other than that, we would hope that we would see grant programs. Right now, there's not much for water and wastewater services. Maybe with COVID and the slowing down of the economy, we anticipate seeing something coming from the province and the feds, but there is no programs that have been announced. We actually had anticipated seeing something in September, October. Now, as I understand, the feds have indicated they would perhaps be coming forth with a program by the end of the year. So we've not incorporated anything into our program right now, but we would be hopeful over time we might see something there. So that basically means, and as kind of an external, the Municipal Act is almost like a local improvement. We only see that if you're going to basically extend the servicing out to unserviced areas, that you might be able to collect some extra capital charges, but we haven't included that right now. So really, oh, sorry, just step back. So really we're down to, for the most part, are we going to generate the money from operating budget transfers? So are we going to, the rates will generate a certain amount of money, and we have provided for that, but we've transferred them all into reserve funds. So the money will be generated from the rates, and we put them into the reserve funds because your capital expenditures will vary from year to year. Maybe $2 million this year, drops down to $1 million the next year, up to $5 million. So we've driven the funds from the operating budget, and we basically put them into the reserves in order to help smooth out that year-to-year fluctuation. And then if we are, we don't have enough money coming in the reserves or coming from directly from the rates, we have to fall back on debt. And the debt is either for the non-growth expenditures, so replacing your infrastructure, but we may run into cash shortfalls on the growth related. Sometimes you always have to build the water and the sewer infrastructure, and then once it's in place, then growth occurs. And right now you collect from the developers at the time that they have the building permits issued. So there's capital investment now, and then at some point you'll be collecting the revenues. Now, I would highlight, and when we get into just next couple of slides, that our forecast right now, or the detailed analysis that we've done so far, does note that we're going to enter into a negative reserve fund balance for the development charge reserve fund for water. Wastewater seems okay, but on the water side, it appears we're going to go into a significant negative, as much as $3 million. So we haven't assessed the impact of that on the rates. The first thing we would suggest to the town is maybe you need to consider discussing with the developers either prepayment, or for them to construct some of the works and get a credit back, or the bottom line is we need to accelerate the growth related revenues. Otherwise, what we'll have to do is issue debentures for that. And then as the contributions come in from developers, you can use that money to pay the debt charges. But we haven't built interest into the DC calculation, so that would mean that we're going to be light in the calculations. So that's just to identify. One of the observations is in the DC side, we need to address that in some policy matter. So if we move ahead, if we take a look at the reserve fund balances, we start off with for rate stabilization reserves, about $4 million and about $1 million for DC reserves. So the life cycle rate stabilization, we're in pretty good shape at about 4 million. The DCs, we're at about 1.1. On the wastewater side, we got about 4.9 million, so good solid reserve fund there. But we are light on the wastewater side, the DC side. So as we move forward, next slide. This is that capital program that we talked about. So thus far, this is the funding that we would assess. So you can see that non-growth debentures is about $10 million. Growth-related debentures, whether we use it as a negative reserve fund, we've shown it here as a debenture, but it's something that we need to work with. We are funding some of this by debt, but we are going to be into a major negative. So we do need to address the issues with water DCs. And then the residual $11.7 million is coming from basically the rates and into the rates, the way into the reserves. So we got a hefty capital program, 31.8 million. About 10%, 30% of it is growth related, and the residual is non-growth related. And between reserve funds and debt, non-growth debt, we're able to fund it. When we look at the wastewater side, we have a little bit broader funding. There are some I&I grants in conjunction with the region. As we reduce the amount of infiltration, that frees up capacity for the region, so they assist in some contributions back. But then you can see we've got DC reserve fund contributions, growth-related debt, and then the rest are basically coming from rates. So about half of it is funded from rates, and then some contributions from the region, and then the rest being DC related. Next slide. And again, one thing we talked about the Water Opportunities Act and the fact that and the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act. And we talked about the requirement to do asset management plans, et cetera. If you take a look at the water system, you can see that both the water and I'll say the wastewater system, they date back as far as 1960. So that's 60 years ago. Some of your infrastructure is 60 years old. And depending on the material type, the performance, et cetera, if you talk to the engineering types, they say that water mains would last somewhere between 50 and 100 years. And as I say, it depends on the material type, how it's been maintained, et cetera. But even if you used 100 years as your marker, you'd be 60 years through that the age of those assets. So you're 60% through. And in some cases, you're actually at the point in time that the infrastructure needs to be addressed. And your total amount of infrastructure, so this doesn't include the regions, but you've got about $54 million in water infrastructure invested and about $46 million on wastewater. And if you divide that by the number of customers, it's about $8,000 for your water and then about $7,000 for your per customer for wastewater. So in total, $15,000 per customer is your level of investment. And then keep in mind, the region also has a level of investment, and they're probably somewhere in the range of $15,000 in total as well. So most municipalities in Ontario face an investment of infrastructure in the range of $30,000 or more for getting the water into the homes, and then as the waste comes out of it, take that and then treat it. So water and wastewater is an extremely expensive undertaking for municipalities. Next slide. If we take a look at your investment, you can see that we've basically most of your infrastructure is linear based. And if we take a look at that 100 million, we've provided for about 23 million or 23% of that to be addressed over the, based on the estimated life, it's about 23 million, sorry. If we look at the age and just based on age, not performance, it's about 23% of it would need to be replaced over the next 10 years. What the capital plan is actually provided for is about $33 million in total. So age isn't the only factor, how it's performing. So if you're experiencing a lot of water main breaks, you need to probably address it. If you have brown water, which means cast iron is rusting. If you're doing major replacement of roads, you may want to replace the water mains. So we have a slightly more aggressive capital plan that's been provided for. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Next slide. This just shows you based on age, you can see that there are a significant amount of your infrastructure which has reached the theoretical end of its useful life. Once again, just based on age, not performance. And then you can see that there's still some further infrastructure that need to be addressed over the next 10 years. So that's the water-related program. The wastewater isn't quite as aggressive. You can see that your backlog isn't as high. It's only about $4 million, but there are needs over the next 10 years as well. Next slide. So we've looked at operating expenditures. So in conjunction with staff trying to forecast out, a lot of the influence on the rates are going to be impacted by inflation, which is generally, we've assumed 2% for many of the expenditures, 5% for utilities and chemicals. And then there's also the purchased water from the region, which the region is looking at, I think it's in the range of 7 and 9% increases in the short to medium term. And then on top of that, we have the increased flows as a result of new growth. So we've incorporated those into our operating budget calculations. Next slide. So if we take a look just at a very high level on what will influence the increase in the rates, you can see that the blue is the operating budget, and right now it's about 4.5 million. Our growth, so the added inflation and then the growth in your flows, which will translate into an increased cost to the region, those will see us increase to about $6 million just on the pure operating budget side. So that's on that particular side is about a $1.5 million increase, or about 30% increase over the next 10 years. You can see the capital related. So this is reserve funds and debt is right now sitting at just under $500,000. But by the time we hit 2030, that segment of your rates will grow to about $2.5 million. So we'll be going from roughly a total of $5 million up to about $8.5 million by the end of the 10-year forecast. Now, the next slide gives you the wastewater side, and you can see that the operating costs are the key driver right now in your rates. And over time, though that will increase from about 3.9 million to 5.5 million. And then your capital related will increase to over $1 million. So your current budget right now, just below 4 million, it'll increase to about 6.5 million by the end of the 10-year period. Next slide. So in looking at those calculations, keep in mind that we do have growth in the number of customers, and we do have growth in the flows. So we have incorporated that into our calculations. And you can see right now that your average usage, an average user will consume about 175 cubic meters of water a year. So if we use that as part of the calculations, you can see the average user is roughly about $438 a year. And over the forecast period, we would anticipate that moving up to about $700. So in the early stage, we would see that increase to about an extra $12 a year in the first year, and then probably about $25 in the next, and then about $28. So that it'll slowly rise over time. But even at a $24 increase, that's $2 per month. So it's not a exorbitant level of increase, but you can see how our expenditures are increased, and correspondingly we'll have to increase the rates over time. On the wastewater side, you can see we started about $472. Our anticipated increase is about $12 or $1 per month for next year. And then as we move out, we'll see an increase of just over $20 for the next year, and then about another $30 or $27, et cetera. So we anticipate the increases to occur, obviously over the 10-year timeline, but we're seeing them at a reasonably sustained level of increase from year to year. If we take a look at your water bills. Oh, so sorry. So this is okay. We'll move forward. So from the your growth, some of the observations, because we haven't completed or finalized the analysis, but one of the things we wanted to point out is we need to address growth-related debt. And we are suggesting, I've talked earlier, that we address some prepayment by the developers to increase the town's cash flow, or to look at have them building some of the infrastructure and they would get a credit back. If we're going to be issuing this level of debt, we should probably update that component of the DC study and incorporate the interest, so that we're collecting the interest, and that'll help our cash flow, obviously. The alternative would be, if you don't want to sustain that level of debt, delay some of the projects. But if we delay the projects, that may translate into delaying some of the growth, and that would have the effect of not having as many users on the system, and it has an implication as well. For the non-growth, if we're issuing, if we want to minimize the level of debt that we're into there, then we would need to increase the reserve fund transfers. So that means that the water bills that we were showing you need to be increased a little bit in order to generate more reserve transfers, or alternatively, slow down the capital program. So that would be something that engineering staff would have to assess based on performance and quality, et cetera, and give some perspective on how we might achieve that. Next slide. If we take a look at your present water bills today, you can see that the orange arrow gives you that combined total. So we're just over $900 as a combined water and wastewater bill for your average customer. And if we look at what we've proposed as an increase for the next year, you can see we'd be increasing to roughly about $940 some odd dollars. That would be roughly about a $40 increase, or about a little over $3 a month increase in the water and the wastewater bills. If we look at you relative to some of your other neighboring municipalities, you can see Niagara Falls and St. Catharines and Pelham are slightly lower than your current bill. Grimsby, I'd point out, they collect water based on a billing system, but they put the wastewater onto property taxes. So it's difficult to assess what the average bill is there. And then you can see the rest of your neighbors, so your neighboring municipalities are actually higher than you are, with Lincoln being, Fort Erie being the highest at roughly about $1,400 combined bill. Next slide. So next steps, next slide, please. So from here, we would seek council's input, guidance, comments. We need to address some policies. We would then finalize the rate study and then finalize the, come back to you with the final calculations. And that would lay the foundation for, in the future, also preparing a financial plan as part of your licensing process. But the key thing right now is addressing your rate increases for next year. I might point out that while we've gone and shown you 10 years worth of growth, we're only suggesting consideration for the 2021. Obviously, the annual budget process will define what the actual rates are, but we've given you some insights as to the pressures that you'll feel year to year as you move forward. And I think that completes my presentation, Mr. Chair, and happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Gary. I know I do have a ton, but I'm going to open it up to the floor first. So if any members of council have a question, by all means, raise your hand. And Mr. Plant, if you wouldn't mind letting me know, I believe we've got Councillor Brunet and Councillor Pachariva. I think they were both pretty much on the mark at once. So who was in the queue first?
Councillor Brunet is first.
Okay, Councillor Brunet, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Russell. Through you to Mr. Scanlon. Gary, thanks for your presentation. I know you said we're only looking at the rates for 2021, but this is a 10-year forecast, I guess. I have a question, Gary, with regards to, you mentioned in your presentation about halfway through that on the water side, you're anticipating through your research that we'll be in a negative of approximately $3 million on the water side. I'm wondering if you could identify on that 10-year cycle from 2020 to 2030, where you see that intersect where we slide into the negative, where you talk about us having to look at either prepayments on the DC side or debentures or something like that. So I'm just wondering if you could comment just on that intersection point over that 10-year cycle.
I will do that if you just give me a moment. I think it's in between the third and the fourth year, but let me just make sure that I'm clear.
Councillor Brunet, are you looking at page 29?
No, I don't
Graph.
have anything in front of me.
Yeah, it's 2025. That's where we go between the fourth and the fifth year. That's where we dip into the negative.
Okay, so Gary, thank you for identifying 2025. So I'm anticipating that when Watson has looked at this growth, that you're looking at the Prudence development. You're incorporating the Prudence development.
Yes.
So is the Prudence development greatly impacting this specifically? Or not necessarily?
Through the chair, it is a significant area to be serviced. There's a lot of growth that'll be occurring in that area. So there is infrastructure that'll have to go into place. Given the size of it and such, it may be one of the key areas that we consider for requesting some financial assistance.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Mr. Chair, I'm just going to ask one more question. I'm sure there's lots of questions, so I'm not going to try to ask a number of questions. Hopefully some of my other questions will be answered further, but through you, Mr. Chair, to Mr. Scanlon, Gary, obviously you work with a lot of municipalities across not only Ontario, but across Canada. One of the alarming slides to me was when we talk about our total infrastructure of almost $100 million. I think the numbers I had written down were 54 and 40, high 40s. So, $100 million worth of infrastructure, and you put up a statistic there about dating back to 1960. So certainly, from what we've been told, a lot of our cast iron has been replaced. I'm wondering if you could just, in your opinion, from municipalities that you deal with, from a technology standpoint, I'm just curious, what percentage of municipalities, Gary, would you say are still using cement lined for their technology?
Well, normally when you're talking water systems, something like lined as in they've gone through instead of replacing the asset.
Yes, yes, sir.
Lining. That is, we're finding that those are municipalities. The lining, as I understand, and I'm not an engineer, but I talk to a lot of engineers, I understand the lining probably gives you somewhere in the range of, let's say, 25 years extended life on that asset. So that if you have significant problems and you want to buy forward some time, then the cost of relining is basically about a third of the cost of replacing, but it'll allow you to obviously triple the amount of work that you can address, and then it buys you forward 25 years. Now, the caveat to that is that not all of your pipes will be able to be lined. As you say, cast iron is probably one of the good examples where, because of the depending on how they've been treated and stuff, there's a lot of tuberculosis in it, and you get this brown water. So they're one of the ones that are more difficult to treat. But there can be, depending on how well the system's been maintained over time, there could also be other types of I don't know how to describe it, crud or whatever, which is starting to take your pipe from this size and make it smaller. So when you go in and then you start to use that cement, you're reducing the diameter or the flow even more. So you can't do it in all cases, but it is helpful in the right circumstances.
Okay. I only asked that question because I know from my career from the late 80s probably through to the early 2005, I know it was widely used in a lot of municipalities, and I do believe it's exactly where you referred to the fact that municipalities looking to get themselves through a period of 20 or 30 years, and I know it was widely used. So I just was wondering if that was still something that was commonly used now as we move into 2020 and beyond. So I appreciate your comments and I appreciate your presentation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bernay. I believe Ms. Trawala has her hand up for some comment, and then also Ms. Harris. I think they are both looking for a little bit of feedback on that question. And Ms. Dale is chimed in. So,
Yeah,
Ms. Trawala.
So through you, Chair, I just wanted to refer back to the discussion about going into a negative on the development charges, which is something that we've discussed along with Watson and have been thinking ahead on. I'm not sure, you may recall during the 2020 budget that we have the large project for the Prudhome's water main that's been approved for, I believe, over $5 million. And that was approved to be paid for from debt. But then going forward, that debt will be repaid from the development charges. So that will impact as well in the future. We've already started taking steps to make sure that we're not negatively impacted and that we don't see delays going forward with the Prudhome's development, etc.
Okay, thank you, Terry. Ms. Harris.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to make note about the lining options within water main. So definitely agree that it's in certain circumstances, can you line the pipe? It's typically in larger diameters that you have a better benefit. Smaller diameters in metallic, because the incrustation that does form within inside the pipe, you do definitely have restrictions in the flows and your available supply. The one thing that we are noticing, and while it was a large thing in the 80s and 90s, we're actually starting to see that rather than what was anticipated of a 20 to 30 year crutch for the infrastructure, is actually more, it's closer to a 10-year crutch now. So even in sections where we did have lined pipes, one of them being the King Street, we did have some lining there. You do start to see the breaks happening again within those sections within that shorter time frame now. So instead of the outlook of an extension of the 20 to 30 year period, it's now refined down to closer to 10.
Okay, thank you, Jillian. And Director Dale.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. So just building on Gary's comment about developers prepaying development charges. It's usually not something developers want to do. And the only time they ever want to prepay their charges is when you're in a situation where you've got an old development charges bylaw, you have a new one, the new one's the enactment of when the new charges come into effect. They will prepay their development charges at the old rate because it's cheaper. It's very, very difficult to get developers to prepay development charges. From a cash flow point of view, they don't like to do that. The other thing to keep in mind too is because there was a lot of changes to the Development Charges Act and the community benefits requirements and changes to the Planning Act, one of the things that we also need to do is update our, in addition to doing the community benefits bylaw, we do have to update our development charges bylaw next year. Not that it's probably going to capture a lot of revenue related to water, but there might be some changes that we can look at that may assist once we go through that process.
Okay, thank you, Director Dale. I'm just going to ask a quick question just to stay on topic here. As we're talking about development charges and we're talking about Prudhoe specifically. To Gary and possibly to Byron, obviously you've had some discussions with our financial staff about, again, obviously the balance of our development charge funds. I'm assuming as well that you've had the discussions or has been mentioned about our CIPs where we are offering between the 50 and 75% rebate back to some of our developments. Right now, I believe we've got 3 on tap, specifically that are of large scale. We've got Utopia, which is coming on board, I believe in 2022. We've got the one up on King in Ontario, which is probably another year or so away. And we have a new one starting on King, but there's also one proposed for Prudhoe's. So I'm just wondering if you can give some of your professional feedback on whether or not going forward, that might be something we should take a look at to consider looking at those percentages or that program in general.
Yes, happy to respond to that. I mean, some municipalities in considering this have maybe reduced the charges, but have targeted where the reductions are going to occur. So if water and wastewater are essential and you need to ensure that you've got the revenue to put the major infrastructure in place, they may reduce on the tax supported side. So maybe, reduce the contributions that go to parks or recreation or library or roads or whatever. But a lot of times they will maintain the water and the wastewater charge in its full charge because of the significance of the investment. You've got to put it in advance. You need the cash flow. You quite often have a smaller customer base, because you're only charging within those to get water and wastewater versus, across the entirety of the municipality. So normally there's more consideration given to the tax supported side being reduced and leaving as much as possible the water and the wastewater intact.
Okay, thank you, Gary.
Mr. Chairman, we have Councillor Patriva next.
Okay. Councillor
Thanks,
Patriva,
Chair.
go ahead.
Thanks, Chair Russell, through you to Mr. Scanlon. And I mean, revisionist history is pretty easy to do, but in retrospect, the cement lined probably wasn't a good call because, I mean, infrastructure costs back then were a heck of a lot cheaper than they are now, which kind of puts us in this pinch point. A little bit.
I would look to the an engineering perspective on pinch point, but because you're talking about the performance, but I think what you may have assumed and how it panned out, I think it's being acknowledged by Ms. Harris that you're not getting the longevity that you were hopeful of.
No. And Gary, the last time you did your presentation, and I mean, I had the pleasure of being the infrastructure chair for 10 years, and it gave me a great amount of pride to stand up and say we were at the point of a self-sustaining water system. But these figures don't show that anymore. Is that because of the region and how they revisited how they were delivering water? So there used to be a fixed cost, but then they built in an escalating charge. Is that part of the reason behind this as well?
Well, I think being sustainable in part, or being sorry, I forget your exact quote, but part of it doesn't remove you from the fact that costs will still have to go up with inflation.
Mm-hmm.
I think the key thing is that you had at that particular point, your infrastructure needs were, in theory, under control, and part of that was, the measures that you were implementing to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
And if those measures weren't panning out, it's an unfortunate situation which puts you a little bit behind the 8 ball. But I still don't think that the level of increases that we're forecasting are necessarily negative relative to others that we're dealing with. I've already dealt with a couple other councils this month. One of them is, the big discussion is, do we do 30-30-10 or do we do 20-20-20-20 over the next 4 years? So they're in a different situation. You're in a much better situation because you have made a lot of the positive steps towards addressing your infrastructure. So I still told you it was all good efforts that you were doing over the many years.
Yeah, and I don't want to minimize that by any means. I mean, you look at Hamilton and you look at St. Catharines, they still have lead in their system, and 100-year-old infrastructure that they've got to attack. One last question, if I may, Chair Russell.
Certainly.
Okay. And again, it's based on, and I was quite intrigued by the Water Opportunities Act and strategies for maintaining and looking at different technologies. So a few years ago, Gary, at AMO, the city of Edmonton gave a presentation about using their water and wastewater as a utility. So then being able to borrow from that reserve to fund other municipal projects. What's your thoughts on that?
I don't think, well, I'm not sure if it was the city of Edmonton or it was EPCOR, which is an independent, it's almost like a crown corporation of Edmonton. Okay, so they're slightly different. And I've worked with EPCOR, and I know that EPCOR has been aggressive in Ontario, trying to, in basic terms, become the utility. So we'll take it away, and and we'll do all of this stuff. So I guess the thing that you have to consider is, in that is, how much do you as a council want to have control over your connectivity with your residents, rate increases, and keep in mind that if you sell the assets to the provider, that you get a one-time cash infusion, but then they've got to have the money to buy it off of you. So in essence, the rates should, in theory, jump up immediately. So I've just given you $100 million, but that $100 million isn't in the rates. So at a minimum, I've got to, if I'm borrowing at 5 or 10%, I got to put that money in. So what you would probably find is a significant jump in the rates immediately.
Okay, because I understood, I thought it was them spinning it off themselves. So no way would I want to sell the asset to a third party, but thought of doing that, creating our own corporation and managing it. So
and the one point I always emphasize is that, and this came out during the Walkerton hearings, is that a council cannot remove their responsibilities from the Safe Drinking Water Act.
Yep.
You can for wastewater, but if you give it off to somebody else, which was the whole issue, the municipality gave it to their utility to run.
Mhm.
It was the utility that, in theory, had the error, but the counselors were still responsible.
Yeah.
So selling water service off to somebody else, you're still responsible at the end of the day.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I believe Councillor Mikulik was next. Is that right, Aaron?
That's right, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Councillor Mikulik?
Thank you,
Deputy
Mr.
Mayor?
Chair. Thank you, through you to Mr. Scanlon. Thank you for the report. Very informative. I needed my glasses for that one. Just curious, I don't have the numbers in front of me as far as the projected development and the, the increases in capital. Has the potential, the possible Beamsville redevelopment site been factored into this? I know that there's a considerable blip in expenditures for this year, but I don't seem to recall any sort of, substantial increase that would reflect that sort of a sizable development. But I don't have that info. I don't have that report on my screen right now.
Gary, you are on mute still.
Apologize for that. So was that, just to be clear, was that growth-related capital for Beamsville, or was that the replacement assets?
Well, my thoughts would that would be growth related, and the interesting piece to that growth related is it's more or less an infill site rather than a Prudhome's. Let's take for example that took quite a bit of capital to run infrastructure for that sort of a distance, where the Beamsville is more. Would it be considered an infill redevelopment site?
Well, we've got as growth, and this is reflected in the DC. So we have South Service Road improvements from Bartlett to Ontario. And in the Beamsville area, we've got I think Hickson Street is also in servicing Beamsville. We then have some pipes in Cherry Heights, which I think is in Vineland. And then we've got the Prudhomme. So we've got the growth-related capital that we've got in here right now is in the range of about $12 or $13 million for water. But a lot of it front-ended because of Prudhomme's.
Yeah, thank you. Well, my guess would be that this sort of a development would, and again, I'm not 100% sure, it's all timing, would probably be within, let's say, 5 years or so. Does that make sense? I'm not.
Perhaps I can get some assistance.
I think to clarify, he's referring to page 14, where it actually shows the number of new users potentially coming on. If you want to jump over to that, and
Mr.
whether,
Chair?
yep.
I think the Economic Development Officer would like to make a comment.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, for me, I'm actually going to turn to Ms. Dale. I think the council is referring to the BDSS site.
Mr. Chairman, so the Beamsville District Secondary School lands, it's right now it's premature to come up with a unit allocation for that, because we have to go through a secondary plan process and look at, what lands are going to be used for some sort of community purposes, parks, all those sorts of things, and then see how much land might be left over for units, what types of units, and the numbers. So at this point, because there isn't a secondary plan on those lands, we don't know the unit numbers yet.
Okay, I appreciate that. I'm just trying to, predict the future somewhat, if possible. And then, if I may, Mr. Chair, I have one more question. I'm going to allow other councilors to ask questions as well. But how does, through you to Mr. Scanlon, how does climate change play into this? My feeling or my thinking is that we seem to have an increased amount of water supply with rising lake levels. We draw our water from the lakes. We seem to be having increased water supply. How does that play with the water conservation? narrative, or not narrative, but
Well, one thing, an observation, which you've observed the increase in water levels. And I know that 20 years ago, we had the same type of thing where they rose up in a peak. And I remember it well because I was hired by a municipality, well, Chatham-Kent, to take a look at major, lake protection initiatives in order to deal with the rising water. And then after that, it tended to go back down, and now we're on another increase. So I'm not close enough. I'm not a scientist to understand why it rises and falls. I do know that from a climate change perspective, we are experiencing generally the same amount of waterfall annually, but what we're experiencing is that it comes in shorter, heavier bursts. And I know that for at least for stormwater management, it's causing problems because the historic marker used to be a 1 in 100-year storm. And if we go down to a place like Tecumseh, they experience what they call a 1 in 7,000-year storm. So the intensity and over a short amount of time. So I'm not quite sure how that pans into water. I know it may impact on wastewater because of infiltration. And as well, if you've got combined sewers, like a place like Hamilton, the old part of the city, the downtown, it's all combined water and wastewater. It's all combined storm and wastewater pipes. So I'm not close enough from the engineering side to understand how it'll proliferate into water, but I do know it'll impact on your wastewater system and your stormwater system.
I appreciate that. I just I asked that question from a financial perspective, as water is, we purchase water and we supply water, and what's just trying to get a balance of the messaging between conservation and usage, and that's just trying to determine that balance of
An interesting observation, because I've been assisting the municipality for many years, is that if we go back, 15, 20 years ago, your water usage per customer was in and around the range of about 250 cubic meters per customer. You're now down at 175. And there's probably a couple of different things that have impacted on that. The change in technology. So washing machines and dishwashers are now low flow. So they're saving water. The lot sizes that you're building today are much smaller. So there's not as much outside water use, to water the lawns and such. And then you're getting just a change in the building code requires low flow toilets and stuff like that. So all of these things are, I believe, impacting or initiating a certain level of conservation in itself. So you have dropped from 250 down to 175. So, excuse me, on the, I guess from a performance side or conservation or environmental perspective, that's a positive. But the financial people will say, well, that's my cash register. So if you consume less, I'm not getting as much revenue, which is causing problems in when we got to collect money to pay the system operations.
Okay, I appreciate that response. I'll let the other councillors. I do have one more question, but I'll let the other councillors ask.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Miklick. I think Ms. Harris has a quick little comment to throw in there before we move on to Councillor McPherson.
Yes, thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. Just to highlight from the climate change perspective and how it does impact, like Gary Scanlon was noting, way in which we're seeing rain now is an impact. So if you recall, I brought a report forward about water usage this summer. So just due to the droughts that we had and significant long periods of droughts, that increases our water usage as well. So now we're trying to figure out how to have a system that supports kind of our high demands, but then we can also support when we have lower water usage as well, and then the life of the water, because the water can't sit in the system for an extended period of time because we have to keep chlorine residuals up and things like that. Also, just as with the buried infrastructure, how Gary noted, we have the I&I within the sewers that we have to take into account. There's also, at the same time, when we're looking at moving forward and designing water mains, the droughts the droughts that we have, if the water table does go down, you actually can end up with water main breaks and things like that. So we have to review from an engineering standpoint of when we're burying the water mains, are they deep enough that for what we forecast with the droughts, that we're not going to see those breaks, or slight changes in design to support some ground settlement. So designing a bit more like what they have in California that would support during earthquakes or things like that, kind of putting some of those technologies into place while we're burying, just to handle the settling that does happen around the water main. So there are climate change impacts on both sides, both water and wastewater, that you'd see within the system.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Harris. We'll now go to Councillor McPherson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you to Gary. I'm on page 20 and 21, and I'm trying to make some sense of development charges. And when I look at the page 20, we've got development charges reserve fund as of December 31st at $1.1 million for water and $234,000 for wastewater. Then when we go to page 21, the development charges reserve fund is not being used for water as proposed capital financing, and 2.9 million is used for from wastewater. Can you help me to understand? A couple things come to mind here for me is, are we forecasting development charges over that 10-year period? And if so, am I just missing it in here somewhere? Or how do these two slides relate to each other? Through you, Mr. Chair.
Through the chair, that's a very good question. What we consider is the fact that once you issue the growth-related debentures, you obviously have to pay the debt charges next year and the year after and the year after. So even though we started with a positive balance, the Prudhom's development is about $10 million in projects. So 10 million translates, if we debenture, let's say over 10 years, then you're probably paying 10 million, you're probably paying over $1 million a year in debt charges. So we've had to keep the debt, the money that's there, we had to set it aside in order to pay the debt charges into the future. And then even holding that money to pay the debt charges, we run into a negative in 2025. So it's kind of like if you had set a bank account aside to, for a car, but you went out and borrowed it all. That the money that you got in the bank account will only last you a couple of years worth of payments, and then you've run out of money. Then you've got to come up with the money from somewhere else. And that's the observation that we're making, is that a lot of your infrastructure is up front, and the growth will come after. And the problem is we've debentured, which is fine, but even at that, the debt charges are going to outpace the revenue, and we're going to go into a $3 million negative. And we either pay for that negative through the rates, so we'll increase the rates, or we try and collect the money sooner. Now, Ms. Dale was correct. Developers don't like paying sooner than later. We can do a couple of things. We can increase the water and the wastewater charges, or at least the water, to reflect that we're going to be debenturing, so we can add the interest into the calculations. That'll raise the charge a little bit. The second part is the Development Charges Act allow you as a council to mandate, you can either collect at the time of building permit, or you as a council can say, I want to collect water and wastewater at the time of subdivision approval. So that would move the revenues forward several years. So they would pay at the time of subdivision approval. That would accelerate your cash flow. So these are options that we've talked initially with staff. We thought we would bring it forward to you as part of our discussions. And we can analyze the impacts of whatever you want, but the problem is we're observing a shortfall in the reserve fund that has to be addressed some way.
So through you, Mr. Chair, thank you, Gary, for that. So, you know, a lot of discussion around prud'homes and the impact of prud'homes. And I start to wonder if we shouldn't see prud'homes separately in our analysis, and how the growth there and the build and the infrastructure cost for that development, since it's such a large development compared to the rest of our community, and will have such a significant impact. I wonder if we shouldn't separate out those numbers just to see, you know, what that growth is costing us. You know, it just for me is it just seems to be, you know, skewing, or it just seems to be such an impact here. I wonder if you see that type of thing in other communities that have a project like Prud'home's that is going to add, you know, 10% to the number of homes that you currently have, or a number around that area. Have you seen that, Gary?
Oh, you're on mute, Mr. Scanlon.
I apologize. Yes, we see it often because, as I say, water and wastewater, you always have to build in advance of the development. So you have to invest, and you, in theory, take the risk of doing the investment, and then you sit back and wait for the market forces to allow that development to come along. It's a common issue. In this particular case, you have a very sizable expenditure, $10 million, and the revenues coming in are exceeding the expenditures going out. Or sorry, the expenditures going out, right, exceeding the revenues coming in.
I think you know, I would like to see you know, how that works over a 10-year period. You know, how those numbers look, you know, from a Prud'home's focused, you know, if we had some of these slides just with Prud'home's on them, you know, and how that looks compared to, you know, if we didn't have that development, what would our situation be? I guess just my final comment would be, when looking at slide 14 and we see the new growth in 2020, we've got 43 new customers. And in 2030, we got 780. To my knowledge, Prud'home's is 1,300 to 1,500 units. So how we have only half of that number come 2030, you know, I would question, you know, this growth. Is it ultra conservative, or is this in fact what we think will be built in 2030? Maybe through to Kathleen as opposed to you, Gary.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. So just to give a bit of history, when the fairgrounds development was done, one of the things that the municipality did do, and I think it was CN Watson, I should call yourselves Watsons now, actually did look at, you know, what sort of costs we would recover and growth and all that kind of thing to see, whether we'd be in a positive situation. So that information probably would be very helpful for Prudence. In regards to the actual number of units, it seems to change depending on, who I guess is approaching the current owners to develop the lands. The number of potential units could go up, it could go down. And I believe the numbers that we've used for this study are the numbers that are in the draft plan, but there is always the potential for additional units within that Prudence area.
And if I could, through the chair, we've looked at through the development charge study, we've looked at how the building permits have been rolling out over the last couple of years. So we're to some extent consistent with those, more of the averages of where the market is. It's very simple from a calculation perspective to jack up the numbers, so to speak. The problem is this is your water and your wastewater budget. If we overestimate the amount of growth, and it doesn't materialize, it means you'll be running deficits in your water and your wastewater program. So it is something we are always very mindful of when we look at the forecast, to not be too aggressive in our forecast, because as I say, if you are too aggressive, it doesn't pan out. We're then faced with deficits, which I don't think you want to put yourself into that situation.
Mr. Chair, if I may make a comment to that?
Comment or a question?
Comment, just comment. So,
Okay.
through you to Gary, yeah, true. I can see that, but as you said, if we're looking at an upfront investment of in excess of $10 million, we need to have those numbers as accurate as we possibly can. That if we are underestimating the build, we are showing a much more expensive number than if we were, if that number was, instead of 780 was 1,000 or was, 1,200. How does the numbers look then? And are we being ultra conservative here in our growth, and it's going to cost us as a result of that upfront spend? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Councilor McPherson. Before I move to Mayor Easton, I just want to have a follow-up question on that because I want to stay on point. So to Mr. Scanlon or possibly to Ms. Trowalla, when you were analyzing Prudence with that, and you mentioned again, our costs are going to exceed our revenues from a DC standpoint, or from a project standpoint with DCs in mind, were you factoring in the full DC payment that we'd be receiving from the developer, or was the CIP or potential CIP factored into that to reduce that amount?
So I'm not sure if so to you, Chair, if Gary has any to bring up. So I was just going to suggest perhaps we can revisit some of these Prudence numbers that we're discussing and bring it all back to council at our next water budget discussion to have a more fulsome discussion on the Prudence numbers side of it. And then bring it back.
Okay, it's interesting. Mr. Scanlon, I see your hand. I do see Miss Richard Dale wants to make a comment as well, but Mr. Scanlon first.
Just to respond directly to your question, we did not discount the CIP. We put 100% of the charges in there. So if there was any further reductions, then we would obviously reduce the cash flow, but that would increase the rates to compensate for the loss of revenue.
Right. So again, if we were to rebate back between 50 and 75% of those DCs, you would see a dramatic increase in, or again, you would probably have to see an offsetting increase in rates. Oh, you're still on mute.
Sorry, I thought I clicked. If your reduction is in the water and the wastewater area, that's exactly what will happen. If you're reducing the development charges on the tax supported side, that has its own set of implications, but that's not, we're not talking tax supported today, so.
Right. And Director Dale, your hand was up as well.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I was just going to kind of make a sort of a general comment on growth. And so we're allocated a certain amount of growth from the region, and the region is reviewing a lot of, those numbers, and there will be some revised growth allocations provided by the region because they have to go over a longer term horizon. But what we're finding is, and some of the properties that you don't think will get developed, we are starting to get a lot more interest in redevelopment, particularly in the Beamsville area. So, and these are ones that you can't always say, well, it's going to happen here, it's going to happen there. It's just, somebody looks at amalgamating a number of properties. They pick up some properties along Ontario Street, for example. So over time, you do see redevelopment of those parcels. And if those things do come to fruition, that may also help bring in additional development charges.
Okay, thank you, Director Dale. Mayor Easton, if you'd like to go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask more than one question under the conservation piece. Will you allow that?
Certainly.
Okay. I think it was probably maybe 5 years ago. It became very clear that people were doing such a great job at conservation that the region was going to be missing out on considerable revenue. And therefore, our costs went up considerably. They also had a different way of looking at fixed and variable. So I expect that we're probably going to see that as a factor this next year as well, because I think we just got the news on, Gary gave us some news on, how much the usage is. So I think there will be impacts in that area as well. Also, Mr. Chairman, we haven't really looked at development scenarios, and so I want to reflect somewhat of what Councillor McPherson is talking about as well, and I think partly where you may be coming from. I believe that the system that Lincoln has had for a long time now, that model I think it served us pretty well. When there wasn't any growth and we were lining pipes, I think that was a sensible thing to do. Now we found out that the longevity isn't exactly, it's maybe half of what we expected, but it still bought the town a lot of time and it gave us some good integrity. We shouldn't underestimate that, I don't think. But now it appears as though we should be developing a new set of scenarios, combinations, permutations that also take into account where we think we need to be in terms of the kind of infrastructure that's going to give us a quality response, a realistic response to climate change. I don't want to talk about these things as CIPs because we have too much bias on that and we don't have as much information as we need. So my question to you, Mr. Scanlon, is it the role of Watson to assist in the development of scenarios and where we may have only had one model in the past with several parts to it? Would we be advised, we'll start with the prudence piece that Councillor McPherson spoke to, but would we also be advised to look at to other scenarios as well, because if we start doing infill, we might find ourselves in a situation, particularly along King Street, where we have 40, 50 units going in and quite an aging system in that area. I suppose we could say we've already had a partial experience on Lincoln Avenue. And maybe we had all those things on a list of work, capital works that needed to be done. I don't really know about that. I can't recall. Where do you think we need to be going? Because I am not in a position to make any decisions about this. I think your report is excellent in terms of, look, folks, there's a whole lot of things going on here. But somehow we've got to get these models into a format where we can start to cost everything out, determine what we need with the kind of impacts we have that are telling us to have this quality versus this quality. What would you say to that?
Yeah, you're on mute, Mr. Scanlon.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you again for correcting me. I think scenarios are appropriate, and we do run different types of scenarios. In this particular case, I guess we've talked about supply. So if we brought on more supply by infill or whatever, does that increase the number, our growth level? That would be one question in one scenario. I guess the answer is, does all of this development increase the marketability, and do you sell more units? Because that then, I think Councillor McPherson, that's where I think he wanted to talk, is should we be building more development into our scenario? So, I mean, we can test some low, medium, high scenarios for you. We can talk about how that'll impact a lot of your operating costs, honestly, with the exception of the region. A lot of your operating costs for the most part are fixed. And so that the day-to-day expenditures for the most part are fixed. Where you see variations is in your capital expenditures, because that has to be funded. So if you expand your capital program, potentially it has impacts on your rates. The regional charges, that has an impact. And then obviously how much growth and how fast or how slow has an impact. So those, if there are scenarios, those would be the areas that we would test.
Okay, so Mr. Chairman, if we agreed that, not the criteria specifically, but I certainly understand where you're coming from. If we decided that we're going to do that, is there any benefit then to us looking at different locations in the town, oldest versus newer, or I guess that's probably the simplest one. Should we be looking at different locations?
Is that a question to me, Madam Mayor?
No, I'm sorry, to Mr. Scanlon.
Sorry. Sorry, and if you could, through the chair, if you could clarify, Madam Mayor, are you suggesting that we vary the water rates by area, or we vary the development charges by area?
I hadn't even thought about that. That's interesting.
I wasn't.
But in a way, but in a way, you know, maybe in a way that's not so far-fetched, because if you're looking at certain areas, maybe the cost to actually develop those areas would be, I mean, it should be less costly to deal with a green field than it would be to deal with almost anything else. So are we considering, and maybe, this is probably not going to be helpful. The point I want to make is, it's all very interesting, but I want to make the point that I don't think we're going to come up with one model. I don't think we should. We should be looking at different models, and we should be building the, really worthwhile discussions on the look and feel of our community, as well as things like climate change. Particularly, around the new regional policies that relate to environment. The overlays are very significant. And I think that all of these variables are going to have, they're going to have an impact on what our overall costs are in the future. I don't know whether you have any insight into that, whether you have thought about that at all, but I just don't see this as one size fits all anymore.
Sorry, through you, Mr. Chair, I'm just going to step in for Gary for a second. So when we identify our capital plans, there's a number of items that go into kind of identifying which projects we bring forward, including overall asset performance, if there's other capital needs within the area, the age of it, of the infrastructure itself, and then also just the general asset management plan and going forward when it's in place as well, the climate adaptation plan will also come into consideration. So all of those things are reviewed throughout the year, but then also annually as we're updating the 10-year capital plan and the preparing for the budget seasons as well. So in essence, I believe what you were asking about kind of how to rank projects or how to bring things forward is being considered through that standpoint of looking at it cohesively across town.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I just want to, I don't want to lose sight of this discussion. That has been very helpful. I hope we're not going to be in a hurry to make a decision on this, because there is, I think, being able to discuss these things further and to digest it more it's going to be really important, because this is we're setting ourselves up now for the future, and I think it's got to be, we got to get some longevity out of this as well. Thanks very much.
Again, I agree completely, Your Worship. And again, just looking at some of these numbers, again, some of them are jumping off the page in an alarming sense. So I think we definitely do need to, as Mr. Walla alluded to earlier, take this up again at another meeting. But I know Mr. Walla has a comment. Councillor Mikulik also has a comment. I still have my questions. So Mr. Walla, if you want to just make a comment on the mayor's point there real quick, if you like.
So to you, Chair, and to Council, it's just more so around, we will be bringing back the rate budget to Cal budget. Today's workshop is more so for you to provide us feedback and for us to provide you information about the rate study itself. So Watson and Associates have done some work with us in order to do all of the background information in order to propose certain rates. But the actual budget deliberation and setting of those rates is actually going to happen at the Cal budget meeting. I think right now we're tentatively looking at the December 2nd meeting to do that. But there is going to be more opportunity to debate and move forward with the numbers.
Mr. Chairman, would you allow me a secondary just to for clarification?
Your Worship, you can.
All right, thank you very much. All right, I understand that. However, and I appreciate Jillian's comments, and so I'm just trying to get my head wrapped around that, trying to determine whether or not that process that we've been using, is it going to be enough, or is there going to have to be further clarifications? Are there going to be additional options that might be available to us? I don't want to say I'm not looking for the same old, because I don't get the impression that the staff are doing that. I think you are bringing in a lot of variables. And so I guess as we go along, if we know what our options are, and I guess the only caution that I would have is let's put all the information on the table for council, for us to make a decision. And even if you're just explaining to us what it is that you've done and how you arrived at that, that's going to be extremely important to this. Otherwise, we will be making decisions based on pretty much the same kind of options as we've had in the past. I don't think we want to do that. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
Oh, thank you, Your Worship. Before our Deputy Mayor jumps on, he was quick on the unmute there. I'm just going to ask a couple quick questions because I haven't gone around yet. The first one is if you want to flip over to slide 12 in the presentation. Two quick questions about this. With our base charges, did they change at all when we went to the new water meters, or were we still at the same number? I think that's probably to Ms. Harris or Mr. Walla.
Through you, Mr. Chair, no, the rate charges or the base rates were as per the previous agreed to base charges that are in place. It's not tied to the water meter itself. It's tied to the overall capital and operating budgets.
Okay, so if I'm looking at slide 12 here, again, we've got some measurements on the side, which I'm assuming is the size of pipe, 1/2 inch, 5/8, 3/4, and down to 8 inch, and the subsequent base charges for each. So a traditional residence would be in the 1/2 inch, 1745. Is that correct?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair, it'd be 1/2 inch to 3/4. So typically under an inch.
Okay, so follow up to that, a condo unit, so say Utopia, how would they be billed on this? Would they be billed on the building as an 8 inch, or would each individual unit have its own base charge?
No, so each individual unit would not have its own meter. It would have the overall unit would be centrally metered, and then the condo board would distribute the fees. That's typically how it's managed within condos.
But would they have one base charge for the building?
One larger base charge. So it's based off of the infrastructure that the town owns, right? So there's the meter that it's attached to, plus the serviced property line, and then the water that needs to be supplied to that point.
So the base charge level, it would exceed what is listed here as far as from the 1/2 inch to 8 inch pipe.
It would be it's whatever size. Sorry, I don't know offhand which size the pipe is, but it would be based off of the fees or the base charges for that size pipe.
So again, I'm sorry for the back and forth. So if they were, say, the Utopia building was a 6 inch pipe, and just as an example, their quarterly base charge would only be $310?
Yes.
Even though there's going to be 276 units in there.
But we don't own any of the infrastructure within that 276. They're also using a significant amount of water that would be charged on the unit basis as well. That would be considered.
Right. No, I'm just, my concern is that, again, we have a single home, detached home is somewhere in the 1745 monthly base charge or quarterly base charge. And then we have a building with 276 units, and the base charge is equivalent of about 21 homes or less. When there's 276 units in there, I'm just wondering why we wouldn't have a larger base charge for a larger unit.
So through you, it's based off of the asset that the town owns. So yes, there's all those additional units, but it's also the overall impact of the asset. So it's more being used, but their size pipe is that size, and there's the costs that go that way. The additional water usage that would come up or cover those costs then brings in the additional revenue for water used by those additional units, but it's still a plot of land. And coming from that point of view, Gary, I don't know if you want to chime in of how other municipalities handle it, but it's ultimately based off of the cost of our assets, if I'm correct.
Yeah, I think so. There's been a couple of different ways that municipalities look at these increased charges. So that I think what Ms. Harris was identifying was the fact that there's a certain cost associated with the meter, maintenance and replacement and such. And some municipalities have generally set the rates based on that type of costing. So it's just more of a direct maintenance of the meter and such. If we, and my recollection when these were originally put in place was consideration of other of your neighboring municipalities and how they were developing the structures. And I think that it was basically reflecting some of the other larger municipalities. It could have been Fort Erie or it could have been Niagara Falls. So my recollection, this is going back probably 15 years or so, is that that's how you put the rate structure into place. A lot of municipalities now use a structure that's kind of provided through the American Waterworks Association. They have a principles manual, and it ends up with a higher calculation, and it's more reflective of basically a broader look at the infrastructure costs associated with the individual developments and such. So they've taken a different approach to it. And a lot of municipalities just adopt their relationship structure and implement it that way. So there's different ways of handling it. If I make a comment on your base monthly charge, I keep going back to base monthly because I can remember the rates much better. You're charging in essence about $5 and I don't know 75 cents a month. That's low in comparison to a lot of municipalities in Ontario, and these base rates don't represent a significant portion of your overall budget. So we would look to increase that over time and perhaps increase these base charges. But that's a bit of an aside, but that's how these rates were generated. And if I look at them, they're actually low in comparison to a lot of municipalities.
Okay. Thanks, Gary. I know Terry wants to jump in there, so I'll let her jump in, and we'll go to Deputy Mayor Mikulik.
Sorry, so to you, Chair, I just wanted to clarify a little bit that those base charges, that's the fee for our assets to get water from the plant to the lot. It doesn't really matter how many units are on the lot. It matters what it'll take in order to get the water there. So when you have a really large unit, or a lot of units, like a condo, you need a bigger tube, for lack of a better word, in order to get all of that water in there. And for that bigger tube, it costs more money to maintain. So that's why that whole property, no matter how many units are on it, because they need the bigger tube, they got to pay that higher base rate. If it's just one house with just like the half-inch pipe, that half-inch pipe doesn't cost as much to maintain. So that's why they have a smaller one. And then where those larger condos would start spending more money is based on the variable rate, because the more units, they're using more water, so they're paying more variable. So think of it more so on that way, that base rate is just for getting water to and from. It's not about how many people are there.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Roll. And again, the reason I had that question was maybe it was Gary's analogy of the snowbirds. About I kind of looked at it as like a flat rate that we're charging customers to help pay for overall services they're getting, not necessarily the actual specific amount money that costs to get the water to that specific spot. So I thought it was maybe more of a flat rate that we include, which just made me wonder why it wouldn't be higher for a larger volume area. Anyway, Deputy Mayor Mikulik.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to speak again. So I'm looking at the, if I may, through you, I'm looking at page 14. And something that caught my eye that I was going to ask earlier was regarding water haulers. We live in an agricultural area, a rural area, and I feel like we have many water haulers in the area, but I don't see any increase, any change to that number whatsoever. And I was actually surprised. I thought that number would be a little bit higher, proportionately speaking, with our metered billable volumes. Can you speak to what our thoughts are with regards to the water haulers? Like, I'm assuming these are homes that have cisterns and require delivered water, potable water.
Is this to Mr. Scanlon, Councillor Mikulik?
I believe so, yeah.
So the water haulers pay the volume charge just the same as everybody else on the water system. So they're paying that volumetric charge. They also pay on top of it a monthly charge, similar to the base charge for the other customers. So they're paying a very similar structure. They got a monthly charge, and then on top of it, they pay for the volume.
Okay, and Mr. Walla, sorry, Councilor Mickle, Mr. Walla has some feedback as well.
So through the chair, also water haulers all have to come into town hall. There's a water filling station here. So it's not us pumping water to the water haulers. They're coming here to pick it up. So they pay that base monthly charge in order to have an account and for us to maintain the water hauling station here. And then they pay the per cubic rate for the amount of water they actually use.
Okay, and if I may, but I do believe that there's a number of private water fill sites as well that are located throughout the municipality that would be factored in. But ultimately, the question I had is it didn't go up 1 liter. There was not one or 1 cubic meter. There was not one increase. There was no increase in 10 years in that number or that forecast.
Through the chair, that's correct. The number has varied a little bit, but we've standardized it across the forecast. You will experience some rural developments, I guess, but it's whether any of those rural developments will provide a cistern or whether they'll provide their own wells. So we've just held it static. Maybe that's somewhat conservative, but there's no way of forecasting an increase in the water hauling business. We just didn't have the information to vary it.
Okay, and if I may, just one more thing. With regards to, like, we have a lot of future forecasts, is there any way of seeing any previous data? Is there any way, I feel like the future can be viewed a little bit by looking at the past. Is it possible, not tonight, not today, but to see what the volumes or what the customer numbers would have been, say, during the past 10 years, to get an idea so that I can build a graph or a chart for my own sort of view.
Is that to Mr. Walla?
I would probably say Mr. Waller or Ms. Harris.
If you'd like, I can respond to it. We do have that information, and we did go back to 2016. So it is something that if the counselor wished to have that information, we could provide.
I would appreciate that.
So that's our analysis as well, as to look historically, and that helps to make the judgments on going forward. So.
Okay.
Sorry, through the chair, I was just going to offer to get it and to bring it to the rate budget deliberations.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Mayor Mikulik. Thank you, Mr. Scanlon. Thank you, Mr. Walla. I see no other hands up in the queue. Again, I do think that we do need to revisit this in some form somewhere down the road. Even just looking at some of those long-term forecasts, if we're seeing, as Mr. Scanlon mentioned, a drop in actual use of water down by 30%, but we see our bills going up almost 100% over the next 10 years. I think there's going to be a lot of angry residents out there just wondering where the value is. So I think something has to be done where we investigate this a little bit further. So I look forward to future conversations on this. So with no further questions or discussions, we do have a motion to receive and file as information presentation given by Gary Scanlon and Byron Tan of Watson and Associates regarding water and wastewater rate study and water financial plans. I will now ask our clerk to call out a vote. Can I please have a mover? Oh, sorry, that's Mr. Plant.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Because this is a committee of the whole workshop, we only need a mover. Could I please have a mover? We have Councillor Timmers. And I will now call the vote. Chair Russell,
Yes.
Mayor Easton,
Support.
Councillor Rajima,
Yes.
Councillor Brunet,
Yes.
Councillor Pachariva,
Yes.
Councillor McPherson. Sorry,
Yes.
Councillor. Thank you. Councillor Miklick,
Yes.
Councillor Timmers.
Support.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That motion carries.
Thank you, Mr. Plant. Confidential items, we have none. Committee remarks. Do we have any committee remarks? Seeing none. There being no further business, I call this meeting adjourned at 6:05 p.m.